Welcome today, my special guest, Jaki Shelton Green, Poet Laureate of North Carolina. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be on your podcast show.
How's things going in the poetry world?
The poetry world is vibrant, alive, and very healthy. Because more and more we have more and more young people whose voices across the state of North Carolina are being heard and being published, and they're at the forefront of so many public programs. And that's what I'm really excited about is not only the adult programming, but the fact that we are able to work with young people more and more.
If we go back to the beginning of everything, when did you start writing? At what age? How did that all start?
I started writing when I was very young, and I do mean very young. I didn't even know what I was doing. Um, as a child, I was very nosy, and I have come to understand that being nosy is a wonderful virtue for writers and for any creative being, anybody who's making art. I think you should be very inquisitive and curious about the world around us, and especially the natural world growing up in rural North Carolina. But it was my grandmother who would give me little notebooks and those little tiny notebooks and those little cut off pencils in church on Sunday mornings because I was very nosy. And especially, I wanted to see who was coming in and out of the door every time the door opened. So she said, write your little stories. And I would pretend that I was writing about what was happening sitting around me, the choir, what people were wearing. I was fascinated with the women's hats. When I became older, around the age of, I guess, 10, 11, 12, and I really could write and understood writing, I would slip my little notebooks, my bigger journals into church, and I would write about what was happening around me. So that early, just that early, I guess, invitation from my grandmother, to be a scriber, to document, to tell, uh, has led me down this rabbit hole.
Did it start with prose? What was it always poetry?
It was always poetry, but it's always been prose poetry, basically. And it was not until I started really delving into documentary poetry many years ago that I realized that I basically am writing out of a container of documentary poetry. And that's what I do. I use a lot of primary, secondary sources to retell, reframe a historical or personal event, or to commemorate a historical or personal, event that I want to memorialize or commemorate in poetics. So, um, yeah, it's always been prose poetry, basically. I never, even as a child, my early poetry, I never rhymed. I didn't like rhyming poetry.
So there's no rhyming in any of your poems?
No, um, no, and I have had a wonderful time, of my students telling them over a span now of 50 years that, I don't rhyme and I don't not use punctuation, uh, punctuations and uh, a lot of the poetic devices that people like. Why are your poems like there are no periods, there are no commas? Yeah, but I know where the period and the comma goes, and I know where it should go if I wanted it to go. But I guess I want it to be different. And for me, writing has always been like choreography. I have a dance background, and when a poem is kind of, what's the word I'm wanting it, germinating, when a poem is coming alive inside of me, when it's kind of formulating inside of uh, my brain and my spirit, and my emotional domain, I I first hear the cadence and I see the choreography of it before it hits the page. And so when I'm reading, like when I read my poetry, people are like, Oh, I'm so glad to hear you read that poem because I love that poem. But when I read it, I have no idea how to read it because it's all over the page. It just goes on and on and on. But when you read it, it makes so much sense because I know where the pauses are and where the commas are and where the lift of the voice is, you know, I know where the whisper is. Um, so I always say, learn everything you know about standard writing and poetics and forget it.
And I feel like the reader knows that too. They get a good sense of your poetry when they read it as well.
Yeah, I hope that nuance and rhythm, personification, you know, I hope that there's something else that carries the work instead of it being so codified. You know what I'm trying to say? That you identify it the minute it's read. And that becomes more, for me, sometimes more kind of a cookie cutter or formulated way of writing that, you know, we're all taught that, but I have unlearned that.
How does music play a role in your poetry?
Well, all of the arts um, really influence my work. I love music, and not just the music that's on the radio or on the phonograph, um, you know, or that we hear in a movie, but the music right now of the cicadas that I'm hearing every day, all day, or the music of rain, or the music that's at the bottom of sizzling rice, you know? Training, like right now, I'm listening to this amazing sound that I can't identify. There's some construction going on across the street from me, and I just heard this sound that was just like really fabulous. And I don't know what it was. It sounded like the minute I said sizzling rice, it sounded like sizzling rice. And I have no idea what that tool or machine is they're using, but those sounds are music to me. So ekphrastic writing, ekphrastic poetry is a fun exercise that I enjoy doing myself. I enjoy facilitating ekphrastic writing workshops. I just completed a residency at the North Carolina Art Museum as the Poet Laureate in residence. I was there for 3 years, and I facilitated literary programs for them for public audiences. And one of the features that I did was ekphrastic writing workshops on Saturday mornings, and it was amazing, you know. And it's amazing when we listen to a symphony, we all hear it different. We all hear the same thing, but we all process, filter, we hear it very differently. And those sounds show up. You know, I'm able to capture them. You know, not like a word that I can write down, but they go somewhere in my psyche, and they instruct a line, they instruct a phrase, they instruct a sensibility of a feeling or a sensibility of being inside of a color. So yeah, music is very instrumental to my writing.
The sounds of life, yes. How
Yeah.
do you feel when you go to a big city and like New York City, where it's just, is it noise overload?
Well, I'm always uh, I am always a person who's overstimulated. You know, like the cicadas are overstimulating me right now. Um, so yeah, big cities are fascinating for me, and I have written a lot of poetry on city buses, on city subways, sitting in city parks, just allowing myself to be on total visual cue, on total, you know, olfactory cue, just allowing all of my sensory perceptors to engage with what's going on around me. You know, walking through a neighborhood and only listening to my feet, you know, only paying attention to what I'm stepping on, broken glass or uneven concrete or, you know, uh, a discarded book that I stumble on the ground. Um, yeah, allowing my feet to experience and inform what the experience that I'm having as much as my eyes. Same thing with food. That's a great thing about travel is experiencing all the wonderful new um, and I'm thinking about this trip to Morocco next week because my taste buds will like be on like overload and but they will remember to remember and they're remembering to remember. So the body has memory and the body has memory and the body remembers and all of those things are instructive for me as a writer.
When we go back to the beginning of your writing career as a poet, well, take me back to your first book publication, Mask, 1981.
Well, actually, that was about the third book.
Was it?
Yeah, so the first book is Dead on Arrival. So there's a people don't know this. There are three Dead on Arrivals. So the first Dead on Arrival was my very first book that was published in 1975, maybe 74, 75. And then it sold out. I mean, it was a huge copy print, which was unusual for poetry. It sold out, it reprinted, and it got a new cover. And then, so which year did you just mention?
81. Yeah,
Yes, that was the third.
that was the
So
third. Wow.
Mask. So there was another. So there are three books. The first, Dead on Arrival, has a purple and black cover. The second, Dead on Arrival, is black and white, and the third, Dead on Arrival, is what people have now. And I'm trying to think what is the front of the Dead on Arrival? I'm looking at it in my brain, but there are three different reprints of Dead on Arrival, and then there was Mask.
Okay. Dead on Arrival, the list I saw listed as 1983.
That's the third
That,
one.
that's the third edition.
Yeah,
Okay.
the very first one. It was my first book because I was living in New England and I met Judy Hogan, who was living in North Carolina, who had relocated to North Carolina from the West Coast, from California, and she ran a press there called Hyperion Publishing Company. And when she moved to North Carolina, she started Hyperion South. And I submitted poetry to Hyperion South. Then she created um, uh, Carolina Wren Press. So Carolina Wren Press was my publisher. It still is my publisher. Blair Press took over Carolina Wren Press. But Judy published me in 1974 or 75, my very first book. And it's archived, it's out of print. You can't get that first one, you can't get the second one. They both are out of print.
Hard to find those originals.
Yeah,
People
so
must have them though, right?
I have one of each, just
Only
one.
one. Wow.
One. And I think one of them I found myself in a used bookstore.
Amazing. Whoa.
Yeah, and then I mean, my daughter found one of them online for some outrageous price.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but no, yeah, Mass was my third book.
Okay.
And a lot of people don't even know about Mass because it's not in circulation either. I might have one copy of Mass somewhere. So
Yeah, I
Mass,
wasn't able, I think there were a few high-priced copies online.
okay.
Yeah,
So
they're
Mass, yeah, was one long poem, and it's also included in Breath of the Song.
okay.
Yeah.
So Dead on Arrival, then, how many years did that take to produce the work that went into that first book?
I had been writing, oh my God. I had been writing since the 60s when I was in prep school and then college and then living in New England. So when I relocated to North Carolina, I met Judy while I was living in Connecticut. Then a few years later, I relocated here. And I So this is a funny story that young people will appreciate. They will laugh. So I contact Judy Hogan. She lives out in the country, and I trek out there, and I have a shopping bag full of poems. I have this big grocery bag full of notebooks, all in pencil, right? These great black and white notebooks, and some just sheets of paper. And I go to her, and she reads my work, and she says, "You know, you're really good. You're a good writer." And she said, "I'd love to publish you." So she said to me, she said, "I want you to," uh, she said, "I want you to take all your work back." And she said, "I want to see you. Can you come back like in a month?" She said, "That'll give you enough time." She said, "I want you to go and type everything up and send me a manuscript." And I looked at her and I said, "What's a manuscript?" And I just remember she rolled her eyes, and she just rolled her eyes up to the sky, and she said, "Never mind, just leave the bag here with me." So when I went back in a month, of course, she had typed everything up, and it was, you know, everything was in its proper way. And she handed it to me and she said, "Darling, this is a manuscript." I was like, "Oh." Um, so that was the beginning of my relationship with publishing. Um, and yeah, Carolina Wren Press published Dead on Arrival, the three books, Mask, Singing a Tree into Dance, Conjure Blues, Breath of the Song, and Jakar Press published Feeding the Light and I Want to Undie You. And then I Want to Undie You also exists in the world as a bilingual edition, English and Italian. I have an Italian publisher. Um, and then I have, the albums. I have an album and CDs. I Want to Undie You is a CD, and I have a CD, um, The River Speaks of Thirst, and those poems only exist on the CD and album.
Only.
Yeah, I'm gonna publish that hopefully this year. That manuscript. Yeah. So it's just they're 12. They're 12 poems that are on the album, but I have a larger manuscript that of course they'll be published as a part of.
And you read them.
Oh yeah.
You're the reader.
Yeah, so it's my voice, and then I knew I did not want an album that was solely my voice. So there's one poem that every time I read it, I heard a male's voice. So I invited CJ Suet, who was then he had just been named the first poet laureate of Chapel Hill. So CJ reads a poem on The River Speaks of Thirst entitled um, No Poetry. And there's another poem I wrote. It's called Cultural Whoremongers. And I always heard I always heard it as kind of a hip hop spoken word poem, but I just felt like I didn't have the voice to do it. Um, so I sent it to Shirlette Ammons. I don't know if you know Shirlette. She's an amazing poet, rock star. She has a rock band. Um, and we have the same publisher. So I said, Shirlette, I said, I would really like for you to read this poem on my album. Could you come into the recording studio? I said, because it's not my voice. I said, and I think you. So she called me and she said, not only am I going to read it, but I've already laid the beats for it. So she laid the beats for the whole thing herself, and I like the way it works. And then Nina Freelon and I do sort of a call and response singing and me reading of The River Speaks of Thirst, which is the title poem. Um, yeah. So a lot of the pieces from, well, let me back up. The River Speaks of Thirst was also the entire album was made into a film video, a film dance acting video that was produced by the Justice Theater in Raleigh. They reached out to me during COVID and said, "Hey, we want to collaborate." And I was like, "What do you want to do?" And they said, "Well, we would like to stage The River Speaks of Thirst." I thought they meant the one, the one poem. And I said, "Okay." And we talked a little bit and they're like, "No, no, no, no. We want to do the entire album." So it's fascinating. That film video, I think I'm saying that right. No, it's called a dance video. So that dance film, I got to get it right. There are these competitions called dance film festivals. We have won about, I don't know, 5 or 6 awards for different pieces on the album, on the video. It started with the San Francisco Film Dance Festival, and then the UNC Dance Film Festival. I didn't even know that such a thing existed, and we're invited more and more to premiere at film festivals. So we've premiered at Longleaf. We've premiered. Um, there's an African American Film Festival online. I don't even know where these people are or really who they are, but we won first place with them last year, year before last. We came up again this year in San Francisco, um, someplace in New Mexico, some dance film festival. But anyway, I have been excited about the translation of my work into other art forms, with dancers and musicians, holding space with the words in a different kind of way.
Nice to hear about translations as well. You have
Hmm.
Italian.
Yeah, yeah,
Any
that
other languages in the works?
not yet. So the friend of mine who translated "I Want to Untie You" into Italian is Moroccan Italian, and we've been talking about him doing a version of the book in Moroccan Arabic, because Moroccan Arabic is very different than Arabic or Arabic. So there's an Arabic translator that works with my Italian publisher, but I've also wanted to maybe get them to do a full length book, in Arabic for me instead of just keep playing with the same poem.
Yeah, why not do the whole? Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
You ever see those? Of course, there's those collections that sometimes have the original, and then on the next page they have the translation.
Right. Well, that is
I don't know what they call that.
right.
There's a
That's
name for that, but
right. And that's the way my book is formatted. Um, yeah, it's really sweet. There's Italian on one page or there might be 2 pages of Italian and it's 2 pages of English. Um, that poem, so I Want to Untie You is one very long poem that I wrote for my daughter Imani, who died at the age of 38 in 2009. Um, and I could not write. I wanted to write about her, and I couldn't write about her until 2017. And that's when I wrote this very long poem. And that poem has also been performed by an Italian opera singer. And I mean, we've heard pieces of it. It just like brings you to your knees. It's amazing. It's haunting and beautiful. Um, so yeah, I mean, I stand for the possibilities of, more languages, more places in the world to show up and interface with other writers.
so after those first several, there was a book titled Swiss Time in
Yes.
1990. What was that one like?
So Swiss time was gosh, wow, I had forgotten about Swiss time. So Swiss time was a long poem, and I'm trying to think of the name. There was a guy, he's still in Chapel Hill. Kornberg. I can't think of his first name right now. And I don't remember what the project was. Yes, I do. When Jesse Helms was running against Harvey Gantt, there was a big fundraiser, and um, this press asked a number of us to submit a long poem that they could kind of make into a chapbook. And they made these beautiful, very expensive paper, very elegant chapbooks. I guess there were about 20 writers, and they bundled them with this beautiful gold ribbon, and they sold that bundle for like $350. They were just small,
Wow.
flat chapbooks, but
Limited edition.
limited editions. So
Okay.
That was Swiss time.
Okay.
Swiss time, I think, is in one of my earlier books because I wrote that poem. I wrote that poem oh, in the 70s when I or the no, the early 80s. Early 80s. So I wrote it, it was fairly new because I think it was wasn't it late 80s or early 90s when Gantt ran against uh Harvey Gantt ran against Jesse Helms. I think that was the late 80s or 90s. Maybe it was the 90s because the poem had been out for a minute. Um, so I wrote that poem early 80s because I remember writing it on a train um, traveling from the English Channel to Boulogne, France, and I wrote it on the train. Yeah.
Wow, a train poem.
Yeah, I have a lot of poems that I spent a lot of time in Europe on trains, and um, I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot on trains. Um,
That's
yeah.
that's a great place to write. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Any other unusual places you've written that you can think of?
Uh, at funerals,
At a funeral, really?
yeah, I'm sneaky. I'm sneaky. Um, during church services. Yeah, I'm sneaky. At a wedding,
Sure, why
it's
not?
it's kind of like I get a prompt or I get triggered by something and it's like I got to write this down now. But the good news is having a cell phone and going straight to notes.
Yeah, these days it's easy to do that. Oh, excuse me, and
I have probably 80 poems in my notes.
wow.
Yeah. Um, and I want to untie you, the long poem. I wrote it in notes on my cell phone. The poem showed up at 4 o'clock in the morning, pieces of it. Every morning for about 2 weeks, it would wake me up at 4 o'clock on the dot. And I would get up, go to another room in the house. I go to my study. I could only write it in the bedroom in the bed. And that's what happened.
Is that what happens with most of your poetry? You're struck by something, something just comes to you?
Well, sometimes it's prompted by a research idea. Like right now, when I am not the poet laureate, there's a rabbit hole around my paternal uh, ancestry that I want to go down. I have a lot of photographs and documents. I have my great grandfather's bill of sales, a copy of his bill of sales. Um, my great grandfather and his brother were the first Black Reconstruction sheriffs of Alamance County. And they arrested a white woman one day for public drunkenness downtown Burlington. They were that night visited by the KKK. My great grandfather's brother was was they both were lynched. My great grandfather's brother died. Our family was able to get to the woods, to the, they found him in the woods. He was still alive. A white doctor in Alamance County secretly nursed him back to health. So we can prove this. There's archival record because in the late 1800s, he traveled to Washington D.C. and he testified on Capitol Hill at an anti-Klan activity uh, hearing. So that's the documentation that he survived it. And I've seen that public record of it. So there are a lot of questions around the plantation that is now a historic site in Alamance County. I have just a lot of questions about our family and that plantation, and that I want to write a book. I just every time I go to the historic site, which is a public space, every time I walk the land there, I just feel like my ancestors are just whispering to me that to tell their story. Because when you go to the site, they don't talk about this being a prominent, um, these people being prominent slaveholders. They only talk about them being prominent uh, first fathers of the textile industry in Alamance County, which then became Burlington Industries. But their first tier of labor were their enslaved people. And I've seen um, archival photographs of my great, I always get it confused. I think he's my great great. I always get the greats and the great greats mixed up. I think he's my great great grandfather. I've got to revisit that. But I've seen photographs of he and the same brother who was lynched. I've seen photographs of them stirring the dye vats inside of the first factory. So they don't even, this family and all of this historical lore and documentation, they don't talk about them. And it was our family that put up a historical marker there. You know, um, the only evidence that he even existed is upstairs in the museum. There's this very distinguished photograph of him. It's a beautiful photograph of him. It sits upstairs under a glass, this huge glass like display table, like with just a lot of memorabilia from this family. And there's a picture of Caswell Holt. There is a copy of his bill of sales next to it. And, he's only there because they cite him as being the first black sheriff. So they don't tell the full story. And when I'm there, I'm like, well, where are the others? You know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah.
there's a whole plantation. Like, where are they buried? You know what I mean? It's like, I don't even know where they're buried. So that research is calling me. Um, so to answer the question, sometimes it's a project that I decide I want to take on. Sometimes it's a prompt, or I was at our family graveyard on Mother's Day and there was just a grave that prompted me to do some research on this particular family member because I don't know who she is, don't recognize this last name, but she's right slap dap in the middle of the family. You know what I mean? Um, so anything can prompt me to, you know what I'm saying, to go down a rabbit hole that then becomes a poem.
Are there times where you don't actually write, where you're just thinking and researching and digesting the different feelings?
Yeah, I make a lot of notes though. I might not be writing the poem or making the poem, but the construct of it is happening in notes. Like sometimes my questions for documents or like looking in the eyes of Caswell Holt, sometimes when I'm looking at this photograph, sometimes I just sit and commune with him. You know what I mean? I'm just like, who were you? You know? Um, and he has this long lineage of different marriages, there's a lot of roots that he created. Um, so Uh, a lot of times I'm just sitting with the material, but I always tell people that even when we are not physically writing, we are never not scribing, if that makes sense. It's getting written somewhere in your spirit. You know what I mean? We've created a container somewhere in our psyche, especially when I'm dealing with materials like documents or photographs. I kind of like this idea of the biology of objects, the textures and the physicality of objects. Where have they been? Who held them before I held them? You know what I mean? Why do I have this cookbook? Whose hands? Like who? How you go through an old cookbook and you can see that like somebody dropped batter on it, or there's a
Yes.
grease smear, and I want to know about the grease smear. Like whose fingerprint is that? Whose grease smear is that? Or when I'm working in one of my workshops that's based on what we keep keeps us, I ask people to introduce themselves by way of something that they keep. And it might be a tangible object, but it also might be a secret or a place or a memory, or it might be everyone in my family says I have my grandfather's eyes, or it could be a recipe, it could be a photograph. Um, so just thinking about, you know, when I'm talking to people and people say, well, what I keep is this recipe of a Christmas pastry that my family has been making. I'm like someone would say, I'm 85 years old and this pastry has been made at Christmas ever since I was a child. And the recipe came through Ellis Island, you know, uh, tucked away, sewn inside of a great 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 grandmother's pockets. She came with the recipes, and the recipe has been passed down. So just thinking about the physicality and the physiology of these documents and these primary sources.
So poetry is very much an exploration, an investigation.
Mhm,
Goes back to your earlier point about documentary poetry.
mhm. Yeah, I believe that we are all, first of all, I believe that we're all curators of our own human museums. And inside of our human museums is where a lot of our poetry, our stories reside. For me, I don't have any poems that are not embedded inside of a larger story. And as the historian, archaeologist, researcher in me, that's when the digging happens. I become the archaeologist, plucking out, the tidbits of the poem that are inside of this larger landscape of history or larger landscape of memory. Um, yeah, as a matter of fact, I lecture a lot on when the writer becomes, when the poet becomes historian, when a poet becomes historian, researcher, and agitator.
Nice. I can relate. Well, you're in the 90s, you had a collection, Conjure Blues,
Yes.
1996.
Hmm.
What stands out about that collection to you in your memory?
Um, I had a wonderful time working with Carolina Wren Press on that book and Breath of the Song that came next. Um, I think the sense of, for me then, it was continuity. And then I hit this wall where I shouldn't say this because it's going to sound awful. And I don't mean it the way it's going to sound. Writing the poetry was more important than publishing the poetry. Does that make sense? uh,
Yes.
being with the writing it, because I don't write to publish. And, like I'm really bad because I have not had a book published in a long time. Feeding the Light came out, what? I don't remember.
14.
Yeah, 2014.
14.
And, this is 2024. I need a new book. And it's not that I don't have the material, you know, like, my publishers are, like, screaming at me like, "We hear you read all these poems in public. You have so many manuscripts. Will you just send us the work?" And when I became the poet laureate, I sort of made a vow, a contract with myself that I really believe in being the cultural ambassador of the literary arts for the state. For me, that is outreach. For me, that is not sitting behind a computer and sending out emails or having a newsletter. For me, it really did mean to be with the people, of the people, writing with the people. And in order to do that, I'm not doing my own writing. So there are um, there are some manuscripts that will happen, preferably as books. Um, you know, when I am no longer carrying out executing the duties as the poet laureate, I will get back to executing the duties of being a poet who wants to be published. So I need to get back to that. But I don't have any remorse about it. I mean, I know that it's probably very dangerous when you think about, you know, a conversation you and I were having previously, when you think about how the world is changing and everything is changing. It's probably not a good idea to not, you know what I mean, to not stay current, to not stay in the and, you know, like, I know that branding and um, influence is such a thing now. But I guess I've resisted that a lot. Um, but I do, you know, I do feel bad when I read at a reading and someone walks up to me and say, "Where are those last 3 poems you read? Because I need to read them again." And I'm like, "Oh, they're not published."
Oh, yeah, yeah, so
So, for my readership, I need to publish. For my ego, I don't need to publish. Um, Because I just wanna write. I just wanna write. Um, but I also want them out there, and I need to work on that. You know, if anybody says, so what's your biggest flaw with yourself?" And it's like, not, you know what I mean, not staying on top of the publishing duties, if I could say duties or responsibilities.
it is a
Um,
whole other side to writing that, yeah, a lot of people just don't want anything to do with. They just want to write, and that's admirable of you to yeah, to do your thing and stay dedicated to the position. That was one of my questions was what do you think the role of the poet laureate is? And you you did get into answering that there. So
yeah, thank you.
well, there was Breath of the Song is one of my favorite books of poetry out there ever read. It is a collection, right? A compilation of different time periods.
Yeah, so um, kind of a retrospective of going back, gleaning some poems from Dead on Arrival, gleaning some poems from Conjure Blues, and new poems. So it's kind of like 3 books in one. So there are new poems, uh, in addition to some selected poems from other publications.
The newer poems are at the end, from what I
Yeah,
remember.
yes,
I
that's right.
I think it's in chronological
It
order.
is in
Yeah.
chronological order. Yeah, and yeah, so I was happy to do this and was really grateful that Carolina Wren Press had the insight, you know, to do it, to do a collected edition, and yeah, it means a lot.
Is there one book that you would tell people if they said if they asked what's the first book of yours I should read? Which one would you point them to?
Maybe Breath of the Song because it encompasses some time frames, and then go on to I Want to Undie You and Feeding the Light, and of course, you know, get the album, get the go find the film video, yeah, and look for my new work. But I would start with Breath of the Song.
I Want to Undie You was listed as published in 2017. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so is that the newest? The newest, other
Uh,
than the you had mentioned the album was 2020, right?
right. Yeah, it is the newest,
In
2017. So
print.
that's why I'm kind of like I'm ready to. I really need to bring out another. So it was really my intention when I became the poet laureate. It was my intention to bring out a new book that year, and it just didn't happen. It just I didn't have the I didn't have the broadband to do it. You know, the bandwidth. I was so busy. I was so busy. Not only was I running around the state, but I was also teaching documentary poetry. So, you know, at Duke at the Center for Documentary Studies, and it didn't happen. It just didn't happen. So here we are, almost. It will be 7 years that I've been the poet laureate next year. Almost 7 years, and I still have not come out with a new book, and I need to do that. I was, yeah, I need to bring out a new book. Um, and I think it would have been really good timing if I had, had a new publication during during this reign as poet laureate.
I'm surprised no one pressured you into that for
Well,
commercial reasons, right?
my publishers were pressing me. The two young guys who like pulled me into the studio, they were the most aggressive. And I kept saying, guys, I don't know what I'm doing. And I
Yeah.
and I said, I'll do it if I want vinyl. And they were like, you
Oh,
want vinyl? You can have vinyl, baby.
nice. So they did vinyl?
I have an album. So
There is a vinyl available for the, I didn't know that.
River Speaks of Thirst is an album.
Wow.
Was very exciting for me. We produced the album during COVID. We actually went into the studio before COVID. Like we went in 2019 and we released the album 2020 on my birthday, Juneteenth.
Oh,
My birthday is
beautiful.
Juneteenth. So Juneteenth 2020, we released the album. We were gonna have this huge like release party in Durham, like at
Oh,
Motorco,
but
and we
the,
ended up there were like 300 and some people. And this is before like Zoom wasn't like really as sophisticated as it is now.
yes.
And like it was people's computers are crashing.
Oh,
It
no.
was crazy, but there were over 300 and some people. I don't know. I have no idea how some of these people even found out. I was looking at names because I didn't even know that, I didn't know Zoom back then. So I didn't know that like I could go to like there were like 12 different pages of people's faces. And I didn't know that. And I
Wow.
figured it out. And I was like, I went to prep school with this guy. How does he even I haven't talked to him in, 40 some years. How does he know?
Wow. People tracked you down and they found out about
Yeah.
it, huh?
So there was a guy from prep school on there. It was another guy. It was fab. There were people I had not seen in 20, 30 years. So we never did have like a proper, you know what I mean? We were gonna have like a real kick-ass,
Real celebration.
a
Yeah.
real celebration. And it
Oh,
did happen. But we sold a lot of the albums, and I don't know a lot about music. These 2 guys, both of them are like one of them won't tell me who he used to play for, but he's, like, played with, like, major rock and roll bands
oh, okay.
all over the world.
This is like a session player
Yeah, and, like,
or a
now
touring member.
yeah, he was touring and,
Wow.
um, doesn't is getting back into music, but both of them were just amazing, and so we recorded that album in the living room of one of the guys' houses because we didn't wanna go into, like, a formal studio, and it's perfect. I mean, they knew what they were doing, you know what I mean?
Sure. These
And one
days
of
you can do that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was really fun and funny because one of them, Phil, kinda documented us recording, and, like, there were days that, like, I would be like, "Where's my tea?" Like, I come to the studio, "Where's my tea? Where's
Yeah.
my tonic water?" And
Yeah.
and they'd be like, "Oh,
Just
the
joke
diva."
with them.
the diva has arrived with tonic water. Could somebody boil the water, make her some tea, you know? And then there was Mr. Sinatra the cat. I'm standing, you know, at a music stand, you know, recording into the mic. And Mr. Sinatra would just like fly across the room and land right in front of me, like, and rubbing my nose. And I would just, you know, we'd have to start all over. It was just, it was fun moments. And then there was a time we were in this like serious recording session, and all you could hear was a jackhammer, and there was construction starting right in front of the house. And the guys just went outside and negotiated with the guys, and they said, "You got 45 minutes." They said, We'll go to we'll go two blocks away." And 45 minutes later, they came back and we were done. Um, but yeah, the backstories are so sweet. And then Nina Freelon, when she came in, when I asked her to do it, you know, Nina is a diva, and she called me and she said, "Okay." She said, "Sister girl, you know, I'm doing this for you because I love you." She says, "But you have one day. I can do it Sunday at noon. You have an hour. That's all you get." And I was like, "Okay." But, you know, she does this all the time. She showed up and, oh my god, she, like, knocked it out of the ballpark on the first go. We never needed to do it again.
Wow, one take.
Yeah, she and I, and yeah, it was beautiful making that album. It was really lovely. It was lovely working with musicians and engineers. And what I was gonna tell you is they sent it off to all of these places that review, you know, like first albums and albums. So every day we were getting all kind of heavy hits. I mean, they were like, "You don't know who this is," but like this, like to be reviewed by them to get this kind of commentary right up. So do you know who Pat Thomas is?
No.
So he's this white guy, West Coast, who wrote this book back in the 70s. I think it was called Whitey Gonna Get You. And it was all about the Black Panthers and the whole Black poet kind of movement. He interviews like Gil Scott Heron and the Last Poets, and um, so he's like really hot. So he did a podcast with me. You know, he called me up and he was like, "I gotta have you on my show." You know, everybody's talking about this album. Um, so yeah, we got some really, really good commentary. Um, and then when it became the film, it's gotten all these other awards. So I'm really proud of it. So now I need to get the poems out there, you know,
Yes, get them in print, right?
because I they're not in print. They're only on the album.
Oh wow. Yeah, that would be a nice thing to do, get that done.
And I intentionally did not do one of those little sleeves with the words, you know, with the CD. I'm like, nah, ain't nobody gonna steal my words.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wait
Yes,
until the book is published. Yeah.
yes. I said, no, you know, I'm gonna publish
Nice.
these 12 poems eventually. So it's been fun. I was totally out of my comfort zone to do this album, but for many, many years I go to poetry readings and people would say, "Is there anywhere I can listen to you?" You know, I like
Oh yeah.
listening to people when I drive. And I mean, people would just constantly, "Do you have a CD?" This was back when CDs were a thing. And it's funny because now nobody plays CDs anymore.
I'm still buying CDs.
Um, it's really weird. Like there are sometimes I sell out of the CDs I take with me. Other times we only sell one or two.
Oh, okay.
And but the album sales are picking up.
Yeah, the vinyl albums, that's hot again. So
Yeah, the vinyl's picking up, and, the sweetest thing that happened is I told Phil, I said, "Well, like, now I've gotta go invest in a turntable," I said, "because I gave all of that away," you know?
years ago,
I
yeah.
said, "I gave my brother, like, I said, I had serious expensive Bose speakers and stuff, and I said, "I gave it all away." And so that Christmas, he and his wife gave me they went to Walmart and got me a pink, like, 39.99 record player.
Nice. So just so you could listen to
Yeah, and
it.
they said, "Well, we're not gonna buy you a stereo system. You have to have a powerhouse to listen to it on a real stereo system." But,
Nice.
at least I have a record player. But, yeah, so the album's out there.
Okay.
It's selling, yeah.
And that's River Speaks of Thirst.
The River Speaks of Thirst.
Great. We hope to see that in print really soon. And would
Yes.
you do another music
Yeah,
album?
yeah, Phil is pushing me. I've done some features on some CDs that he's doing.
Okay.
I'm getting some invitations from uh a lot of, and I don't want to get it wrong. A lot of, I don't even know how to describe these musicians, but kind of like improvisational musicians that work with poets, like there's no rehearsal, we don't know what we're going to do.
Okay. Wow. Very experimental. Yeah.
Very experimental. Um, what's her name? New York City. Anne Waddleman, poet Anne Waddleman. She's in her late 80s or maybe early 90s now. I'm not sure how, but Anne Waddleman has kind of made this a thing. You know what I mean? Waldman. I'm saying her name wrong. Okay, she's only 79. I thought she was older. But she does all of this poetry as performance.
Okay.
Yeah, Anne Waldman, and she does a lot of what I'm talking about with a lot of musicians. As a matter of fact, I met her grandson who in Morocco in 2016. I was keynoting a prose poetry festival there, and he was invited as a musician to this festival. And we spent a lot of time together. We gigged together, did some, and he said, "You know my grandmother?" And I was like, "Who's your grandmother?" He said, "Anne Wallman." I was like, "Get out!" So if you Google her, she's pretty amazing. She's a prominent figure in beat poetry.
Nice. I
Uh,
will. I'll look into it.
yeah, yeah. So I've been invited to do some experimental kind of performance, which is not my comfort zone, but I'm always ready to do something different. Um, yeah. So yeah, and I like the style, though it's very confusing for me sometimes. Um, just this whole fusion of screeching jazz horns, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's a little intimidating, but I'm up for it.
Nice. That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to more albums, more books. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been
Oh,
an honor.
thank you for the invitation. What a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Jaki Shelton Green, everybody.